Talk family. Randy Sullivan here with a very special episode for you. We are going to talk about the 9 bourbons that I believe every whiskey lover should have in their cabinet under $60. Now, I will start off by saying that I typically do not tell people what whiskey they should drink, but we do have a lot of new listeners and subscribers, and we're very thankful for all of you guys. And many of you have been asking me, Randy, what do you drink? What's like your daily drinker? So I thought this would be a fun topic. I'll tell you a little bit about what I drink, why I drink it, give you some factoids. It's going to be a ton of fun. We got a lot of ground to cover, so let's go. The first one that we have up is Four Roses Small Batch Select. This is actually a big brother to the bottle that's next to it, which is the Four Roses Small Batch. Really, the only difference between these two products is price and proof. So the Four Roses Small Batch Select is $56.99 at the store that I picked it up at. The Four Roses Small Batch is $32.99, so quite a bit of price difference there. They're both distilled by Four Roses. Four Roses makes their own products. They are non-age stated, so it doesn't have a specific age, but on their website it says that the barrels that go into this are typically 6 to 7 years, or 6 to 8 years old with an average of 7 years. So that's probably a pretty good sweet spot for this brand of bourbon. They're not super focused on the barrel flavors. They want the barrels to kind of meld everything together and produce a rounded profile. They don't want the barrels to be the showcase. The other difference between these two products is just their proof. So this one is 104 proof. This one is only 90 proof. So for me, a lot of times I'll just stick with the small batch at $32.99 because it may not be worth the extra money, but there is some extra oomph in that little bit of increase in proof, and I think that you may want to check it out. Now, the tasting notes on this, Four Roses is characterized by a fruity floral component, right? Four Roses is more focused on grain flavor than some of the other legacy Kentucky distilleries, which is part of the reason why you're not seeing a whole lot of high age statement releases from them. And typically when they have something like a limited edition, there might be some older product in there to give it a little bit more backbone, but it's blended with other barrels to kind of balance all of that out as well. There's not a real distinct fruit that sticks out in this bottle. It is a higher rye mash bill, so there's a lot of dried fruit flavors that kind of get melded together in there. And there's a little bit of a perfume flavor, but because of the higher rye, we taste a lot of baking note spices like nutmeg, clove, cinnamon, things like that. And you can taste a little bit of the barrel tannin, which is interesting. Some factoids about Four Roses. One, only 250 barrels go into their average small batch, which is not that huge for such a large distillery. They have 10 different recipes. So there are 2 different mash bills. So bourbon, of course, has to be at least half corn, but typically the second grain is rye, and that's normally around 15%, but not at Four Roses. At Four Roses, one mash bill is 20% rye, and the other's 35% rye. So that is super high for the industry average. There's also 5 different yeast strains. And on the sides of some of the bottles that we don't have displayed here, what they call their single barrel, which is a more square bottle, it will say kind of a code that you can figure out. The first letter in that code is always O because that stands for the distillery. This company used to be owned by a company that owned a lot of distilleries, and they wanted the barrels marked with an O so they knew where it came from. The second letter is either going to be E or B, and that has to do with E equals 20% rye, B equals 35% rye. The third letter is S. That just stands for straight because it's a straight bourbon. That's all they make. And then the last letter is the yeast strain, and that's where it gets a little bit confusing because there's V, K, O, Q, and F. There are Four Roses nuts out there that have tasted all these. They feel like they've identified the different tasting notes for each yeast strain, and they have their favorites and all that stuff. I'm not that good at it. I just think that it tastes great. The small batch has 4 of those different recipes in it, and the small batch select has 6 of those different recipes in it. And another little interesting factoid, Four Roses only has 1-story rick houses, which is a very expensive style of construction for a rick house. But they do that because the taller a rick house, the more temperature differential you'll have from the top to the bottom since heat rises. And that can cause the barrels to age at different speeds, and Four Roses doesn't like that. So they invest a lot of money in producing a consistent flavor profile by having those 1-story rick houses, and that's something to be respected. Next up, we have Old Forester. Now, not too long ago, I released a video called The 7 Bourbons You Should Have in Your Collection. It wasn't meant to tell you which bourbons to buy, but I was talking about different categories of bourbon. I didn't have any Old Forester in any of the categories, and people said, hey man, what about Old Forester? You caught me. Like, I messed up. I should have included Old Forester. It's a great product. I drink it all the time. It just happened to not have any bottles at the time that I was doing that filming. So I went out and bought a couple. What we have here is the Old Forester 1920. It's part of the Distillery Rose series. I think it's 1890, 1897, 1910, and 1920. 1920 is my favorite. It's the highest proof. It is at a cost of $59.99 here where I live, so it just barely made the cut for $60. And then I've got its little brother, which is Old Forester Signature Series. It is kind of a throwback to a very popular Old Forester product that they had to discontinue because it was too difficult to keep up with demand with the barrels that they had. It was a bottled and bond product, which meant that they can only do batches with bottles that were from the same distilling season. So by getting rid of the bottled and bond, but keeping the 100 proof that would be a bottled and bond product, and rebranding under the Signature Series, it made it so that they could keep up with demand and they weren't gonna have product running off of the shelves. And this bottle is at a $24.99 price point. So the distillery is Old Forester. The parent company is Brown-Forman. Which, you know, that company also owns Jack Daniels. They own Woodford, and they make a lot of really good bourbon. This product is non-age stated, and I couldn't find any averages on their website to give you an idea how old it is. But because it's straight, we know it's at least 4 years old. The 1920 is at a proof point of 115, which is pretty solid. And the Old Forester is at 100 proof, the nod to the bottle and bond that they got rid of. Tasting notes is banana runts all day long. I mean, all of the Old Forester products taste just like banana Laffy Taffy or banana runts. Some people say banana Fosters. And I also get a good bit of a bitter chocolate nib flavor. So it's a little bit of like a dark, unsweet chocolate that's got a little bit of bitterness to it. Factoids, this brand was the first brand to sell bourbon in a bottle. Now it's by law, it has to be done that way now because that's one way to protect consumers from tampering. So if you just sent a barrel out to some store and then the consumers brought their bottles in and filled them up the way that they did in the 1800s, there's a lot of temptation for that store to kind of adulterate what was in that barrel and make it stretch and, try and make a little bit more money. But Old Forester figured out like, hey, I don't want anybody messing with my whiskey before it gets into the glass of the consumer. So I'm going to put it in a bottle and seal it all up so that the consumer knows that they're getting a solid product. And that was a very expensive proposition because back then they couldn't make bottles as easy as they do today. So it was a little bit more, but this product was a pioneer in consumer protection and also built a really good reputation in its day because of it. The descendants of the original founder still run the company. And the other interesting fact about Old Forester is that they are the longest continuously running distillery in the United States. They started production in 1890 and they never stopped. They had a medicinal license all throughout Prohibition, which is that's what cut off all of the older distilleries because there were distilleries that were operating longer, but if they didn't get the license during Prohibition, then they had to shut down. So since they started in 1890, they have been in continuous operation for over 150 years, and that's pretty impressive. Next up, we have Russell's Reserve and Wild Turkey. So Russell's Reserve, if you didn't know, is basically a premium line of the Wild Turkey brand. This bottle is at a $49.99 price point. Its little brother, Wild Turkey 101, is at $18.99, both excellent bourbons. The distillery is Wild Turkey. Wild Turkey makes their own product. The Russell's Reserve, most of the Russell's Reserve single barrels that you're gonna find are 10 years age stated. This one is non-age stated. Wild Turkey 101 is typically a 6 to 8 year old barrel that's going into those batches, according to the website, so that's good. The proof points on these guys, Russell's is 110 proof, which is a solid proof. especially if you're a new drinker and you like to, put some ice on it or whatever because you want to chill it out. This is one that can handle a little bit of dilution and still have some oomph and have a lot of flavor. Same thing with the Wild Turkey 101. 101 is a pretty solid proof point. Tasting notes, cherries. So I always get cherries on Russell's and any Wild Turkey product. Occasionally I'll get a nuttiness, although I didn't get it on these guys. And there's always like this really beautiful, sweet oak smoke. So if you've ever like gone out camping, you gathered up, scrub oak branches that have fallen off trees, you throw them in the campfire, maybe you cook over it, that sweet smoke, that's what I get out of Wild Turkey. And there's a little bit of bitter tannin on there because of the time that these guys spin in the barrel. Wild Turkey was actually a brand that was created due to an annual hunting trip. And one of the guys would bring whiskey with him and everybody loved it. And they're like, hey, you should start a brand. And so they just named it Wild Turkey because they were always out hunting wild turkeys together. So that's kind of a cool little factoid. Another thing that's interesting about Wild Turkey is that they have a very low barrel entry proof. And so I think it was in 2004, they switched from 107 to 110. And then because of the Russell's Reserve line, they had to go from 110 to 115. I think they did that in 2006, but I could be wrong about that. The reason why they did that, so when you think about whiskey, most distilleries go in the barrel at the maximum barrel entry proof of 125. So when it gets done aging, it's a pretty high proof, higher proof than most of those lines are going to be bottled at. So they have to add completely purified water so that it doesn't impart any flavors, but it proofs the whiskey down. Now that's very efficient, and it means that you need less storage space for your barrels and all of that stuff, and it's a great way to make money, but it doesn't produce the best tasting whiskey, at least according to Wild Turkey, because that water that gets added at the end didn't spend any time in the barrel aging. It didn't pull out any compounds. And so when you get a bottle of Wild Turkey, because of the lower barrel entry proof, it actually has more whiskey in it that was interacting with that barrel than the average product because of that lower barrel entry proof. The only reason that they raised their barrel entry proof wasn't because they didn't like the flavor, but because Russell's is a very popular product and its proof point is 110, and their rick houses are very tall. I think they're 15 levels high. And the top barrels will lose some water and the bottom barrels will soak it up. Sometimes their barrels go down a little bit in proof during aging. And that was a problem because if the barrel went below 110, they couldn't bottle it as Russell's. So they raised that barrel entry proof a little bit. But one of the reasons why Wild Turkey is one of the most respected legacy distilleries among true whiskey aficionados is because in terms of its product, it has one of the lowest barrel entry proofs, which means it's got the lowest dilution rate of whiskey that's in the bottle. It's one of the highest proof whiskeys for the price, and it's one of the highest aged whiskeys for the price. So Wild Turkey represents an amazing value, and it's something I think everybody should have in their bar. Next up, we have one of my favorite distilleries, 1792. We got the full proof, which is at a price point of $44.99. We also have their 1792 small batch, which is a very affordable $24.97 at the store that I got it at. It's distilled at Bartonville 1792. This is their flagship bourbon that they sell. It is non-age stated, but I will say that it's most likely less than 8 years because it was age stated until 2013. And they removed the age statement off of the back of the label. And the only reason they do that is if they wanted to start putting some barrels in there that were less than 8 years. So it is a straight bourbon, so we don't know exactly how old it is, but we know it's at least 4, and we can surmise it's probably less than 8. The full proof is 125 proof. Full proof basically means that they're going to bottle the whiskey at the proof that it went into the barrel at. And as we just discussed with Wild Turkey, they have a low barrel entry proof of 115. Most of the Russells that's out right now got barreled at 110. This distillery does do the opposite of that, and they do barrel at 125. So this is a full proof product. The other product, and I've asked the master distiller, Danny Kahn, he said that they believe that this proof is what produces the best flavor, and it is 93.7, which seems odd. Why not round up to 94? I don't know, but 93.7 is the proof they settle on. Tasting notes. 1792 has two main flavors that I get. One is something less of a banana runts than the Old Forester that we discussed, but it does very typically have a banana runts, banana Laffy Taffy flavor. And it very typically has a cherry flavor, but it's not cherry like the Wild Turkey. It's more like a cherry cough drop or cherry cough syrup. So it's what I refer to as medicinal cherry. And I find that I get more medicinal and I get more banana runts on the higher proof. And then when they proof it down to that 93.7, it starts to just taste more like a dark cherry with less of that medicinal flavor to it. It's also got a little bit of cinnamon in there. So, you know, all in all, really great flavor profile. Some factoids. The name of the whiskey is based on the year that Kentucky joined the Union, which was 1792. Originally, this product was called 1792 Ridgemont Reserve, but they got sued by Brown Forman Corporation, who, as already mentioned, owns Woodford Reserve, because they believed that the Ridgewood Reserve and the Woodford Reserve would confuse customers and they'd be able to steal customer sales. And the courts agreed with them, so they rebranded. Another really interesting factoid, if you ever get a chance to tour the distillery, in fact, I don't even know if the public tour has this, but when I interviewed the master distiller there, I was walking through and he points to this still that's no longer in operation, and they have a GNS, a grain neutral spirit still, basically a still that can make Everclear or what vodka is made from. And they have it because the federal government installed it in their facility because they worked with the federal government to produce grain neutral spirit for the World War II war effort. They've decommissioned that still, but the distillery's been there for so long, it's still just sitting there, and it's kind of cool to get to see that. All right, next up we have Bulleit Bourbon. And I almost didn't put this one in here, but I am a big fan of its flavor profile, so I'm going to tell you about it. I'm going to let you make your own educated decision. This product is their 10 years age-stated frontier whiskey is what they call it, but it is a 10-year-old product. So of the products that we saw, the only one that's actually still age-stated. It is for sale where I'm from for $43.99, which is a pretty solid price for a 10-year-old bourbon. Most of the non-distiller producers that are buying aged product are charging somewhere between $10 and $15 per year of aging. So if you can get a 10-year-old product for an average of 44 cents per year, that's pretty good. This product is not produced by Bulleit Bourbon. So this is what we would call a non-distiller producer. Bulleit Bourbon does now have their own distillery and they have their own product that's aging, but they don't have anything that's at 10 years yet. So this did not get made by them at their current facility. It is contract distillation though. They were purchased by Diageo a number of years ago. And so Diageo has owned many different distilleries because they're a huge conglomerate. And the rumor is that this distillate was most likely made at Four Roses. But I have it on very good authority that is not a Four Roses bourbon, meaning it's not one of their mash bills. And that's the difference between just a non-distiller producer who sources barrels and someone who contract distills. The contract distillation process means that that distillery is making whiskey with the company's mash bill, right? So this isn't a Four Roses mash bill. This is a Bulleit Bourbon mash bill that was made at Four Roses, if that makes sense. Tasting notes. I read the tasting notes on this. I didn't agree with any of them. The tasting note for me on this is like a sweeter fruit flavor. I got smoked apricots. So it's like a sweeter, apricot, peach, maybe like a tropical fruit, like a mango or guava. But it's smoky because, I mean, this whiskey was in the barrel for 10 years, right? So there's a little bit of a smoke flavor in there, so smoked apricots. This whiskey is also a high rye mash bill, and so it does have a lot of the baking note spices like clove and nutmeg and cinnamon. It does have some dark chocolate from the barrel tannin, flavors that have been pulled out. Sometimes the tannins that are in that oak come across as like a chocolate nib flavor, but overall very balanced well-rounded, flavorful whiskey. Factoids, this company is owned by Diageo, as I mentioned. They have a 28% rye content in their bourbon mash bill. A lot of people became aware of this whiskey because it was featured in HBO's Deadwood, and a lot of people were like, oh wait, Bulleit bourbon. They looked it up. The timeline didn't work out because the original distillery shut down in 1860. Deadwood was filmed in 1870, but still it did a lot for the brand. This is the reason why I almost didn't put this bourbon in here. The founder, Tom Bulleit, has been accused of discriminating against his lesbian daughter who worked at the company. And she has also made accusations of sexual abuse when she was a child. And so this company has been kind of embroiled in this family battle. I've done a little bit of research. I have not come to any particular conclusion. I'm not suggesting that you should drink this whiskey. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't drink this whiskey. I'm suggesting that you should do your own research and decide if you want to buy this whiskey. I will say that a lot of LGBTQ supporters are boycotting this whiskey. But I was a fan of this whiskey before any of that controversy came out. And when you guys asked what I was drinking, I figured I'd put it in there. So hopefully this content was useful for you. There are a lot of really well-made, beautiful flavored whiskeys out there that are not hard to find. Every whiskey that I put in here, you should be able to go find on your local shelves. I bought all of these whiskeys within the last 24 hours. It was not that difficult to find. And, I get it. Everybody wants to go out and chase after those allocated bourbons, and that's great. But the reality is most of these bourbons would hold up against those allocated bourbons in a blind tasting. And so if what you want to do is go out and have a great whiskey experience, these are some bourbons that I'd recommend that you pick up. We also should probably take a second to welcome all of the new watchers and listeners to the Bourbon Real Talk channel. And I always sign off with the same sign off. And because we've got so many people joining so quickly, I want to explain it so it's not confusing. I had a younger brother, and unfortunately he made the terrible decision to take his own life in 2014. And that made me realize that there's a lot of people out there that feel disconnected to the world around them. I'm seeing a lot of division in our country right now. And I believe that bourbon brings people together. And I believe that bourbon can make people feel like they're a part of a community and they're not alone. And for that reason, I started this podcast, and I always sign off with the same sign off. And that is, if you woke up this morning and you were unsure whether or not anyone loved you, just know that I love you. And I'll see you next time on Bourbon Real Talk.
This content is being brought to you by the Bourbon Real Talk American Whiskey Aroma Kit. This is a tool that I put together to help all you whiskey aficionados out there develop your palates. You can sit down with the vials and train your senses, or you can sit down with a great dram and break that whiskey down to its components. If you have any interest of purchasing a kit of your own, head on over to bourbonrealtalk.com/shop and pick one up. Thank you for listening.